will not be returning to normal because there will be no vaccine in the weeks ahead. Some argue even in the months ahead. It is a long way off. And unless and until that vaccine is developed and then administered to every single Victorian, we will have to live with and embrace a COVID normal. More than 1,000 different scenarios have been put into this supercomputer. You can't argue with this sort of data. You can't argue with science. You can't do anything but follow the best health advice.
This is a difficult conversation to have with people now in an almost kind of threatening tone when people who want to get vaccinated can't because we don't have enough stuff. There will come a time, though, where I think restrictions will apply to those who have not been vaccinated rather than restrictions applying to all of us. Now, if that's not an incentive to go and get vaccinated, I don't know what is. But I can see a time when to get into a venue, to attend a major event, to participate fully as a customer, a client, a ticket holder, a patron, a viewer, however you want to look at it. Being vaccinated will mean you get in, and not being vaccinated will mean that you don't.
From a situation where, to protect the health system, we've got everybody locked down, we're going to move to a situation where, to protect the health system, we're going to lock out people who are not vaccinated and can be. If you're making the choice not to get vaccinated, then you're making the wrong choice. You're making the wrong choice. And for safety's sake, and back to that point about how much work our nurses have to do, as this becomes absolutely a pandemic of the unvaccinated and we open everything up, it's not going to be safe for people who are not vaccinated to be roaming around the place spreading the virus. That's what they'll be doing. So there's every reason to get vaccinated. And there are appointments available, and there'll be even more appointments available throughout September, October, November. Let's get to those thresholds as fast as we possibly can. But yes, there's going to be a vaccinated economy, and you get to participate in that if you are vaccinated. These sorts of passports are designed to do exactly that. They won't be there forever. I can't say, as I stand here right now, how long it'll be on, how long it'll be a feature of things. But, arguably, it won't be a vaccine passport you'll be showing in the first half of next year. It'll be your booster passport to show that you've been to have your third jab and that you've still got the protection that comes from either AstraZeneca, Moderna or Pfizer.
In early 2020, as the world was in the grip of panic with regard to an international public health emergency, namely the SARS-CoV-2 virus or COVID-19, Australia had very low numbers of reported infections. As infections and deaths reached high numbers in other parts of the world, Australia's numbers remained comparatively low. However, this would not stop the Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, from adopting the most strict, invasive, and for many, catastrophic policies in response to what he now terms the pandemic event. Despite statistics clearly showing that this virus was no more dangerous than the common influenza virus, and that the only people at risk were those with comorbidities and the very elderly, Daniel Andrews, acting as Victoria's Premier, went on a mission seemingly to destroy every fabric of our society. Melbourne endured the longest lockdown in Australia, if not the world. The Andrews government issues a state of emergency declaration, suspended Parliament for long periods, and pushed through a whole host of restrictions on the lives of Victorians that were not only completely unprecedented, but entirely failed to curb the one thing that was the purpose for their introduction in the first place, the rate of infection. Dan's daily press briefings became a sorry ritual for many Victorians, waiting to hear what the rules were going to look like for the next 24 hours. As the first lockdown was introduced, workers were divided into two camps, essential and non-essential. Essential workers were permitted to continue earning a living, whilst for the non-essential, they were further divided. Some non-essentials were able to work from home, whilst others became involuntarily recipients of welfare, draining the public purse. Business owners of non-essential services or suppliers were offered certain tax concessions and grants but nothing that addressed the complete loss of confidence that resulted from these measures. And again, the public purse got hit at a state and federal level. Interesting to note that while small businesses were forced to close in retail, restaurants, cafes, pubs, hairdressers, etc., large chain stores were granted permission to remain open, having the means to introduce click and collect services. Other lockdown measures included travel restrictions, not being allowed to leave the home unless you are an essential worker, shopping for essentials, going to get a COVID test, seeking other health care, or caring for a vulnerable person. Daniel Andrews, Victoria Police, tasked with making sure that people were not travelling more than 5 or 10 kilometres from their home, depending on which day and what restriction level of the lockdown was in force. At one stage, shopping was restricted to one person per household per day, permitted to leave the home to shop for essentials only, all other shops being forced to close anyway. A ring of steel was introduced to deter city dwellers from visiting rural areas and vice versa. Again, those caught violating the rules were handed severe fines. Essential workers had to carry permits, show your papers please, in order to cross the ring of steel, or in order to explain to policy enforcers why they were not in their homes. Exercise was limited to 1 or 2 hours per day, again depending on the ever-changing restriction stage and the case numbers. Congregating for exercise was limited to groups of 2 or 4, but from only 2 households, again depending on the mysterious algorithm of their health advice. Compulsory mask wearing was introduced. Fines issued for failing to comply. This measure added to the isolation people were feeling by removing facial expressions from communication and making it harder to understand one another, being muffled by fabric. We are yet to see the impact that the masking will have had on babies and toddlers at the time. Social distancing was introduced to stop the virus from jumping from one person to another, but only added another level of restriction to behaviour and socialisation, as well as adding to the sense of isolation. A curfew was introduced, meaning that people were not allowed to leave the home between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. unless for essential reasons, and once again, massive fines issued to those breaking the rules. The explanation Daniel gave for this one was that it was based on the advice of the police commissioner, that it would enable them better to enforce the other rules. Strict limits were applied to the numbers allowed at weddings, 5 people at one stage, and funerals, 10 people only. Even more cruel and unusual was the treatment of the elderly in nursing homes and their families, people being deprived of visiting their elderly loved ones even on their deathbed. A great number of the elderly in nursing homes died during this period for reasons that have never been adequately explained. Schools were closed on and off, further increasing tensions in the household and depriving children of much-needed interactions with their friends and compromise their ability to explore ideas in real time with their teachers. Churches, mosques, temples, and other places of worship were forced to close, once again to limit the amount of exposure to the potential virus and limit the number of cases. No value whatsoever was attributed to people's spiritual well-being or their being able to practice their faith. QR codes were introduced to track and trace potential infections. No concerns given to individuals' right to privacy. Close contacts of positive cases were forced to quarantine at home for 3 or 5 or 7 days, depending on the stage of restrictions, in turn depending on the health advice. At one point in time, certain suburbs were locked down whilst adjacent ones were relatively free. At another point, entire commissioned housing buildings were locked in for days on end. It seemed as though there was only two statistics that mattered: COVID case numbers and death numbers attributed to COVID. Daniel Andrews was at war with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and all Victorians were simply casualties of this man's war. As traumatising as all of 2020 was for Victorians, it was only an appetizer compared to what 2021 brought. With the introduction of a vaccine that had only been approved for emergency use by the FDA, Daniel Andrews dangled a carrot for Victorians to end their plight in and out of lockdowns with ever-changing rules. Take this vaccine and your life can go back to normal. When it became apparent that vast amounts of the population were not forthcoming in accepting the experimental vaccination, the carrot quickly turned into a stick. Industry by industry, people were given an ultimatum: accept the jab or be prepared to be without the means to provide for yourself and your family. Health workers, who had been touted as heroes for being on the front lines during the pandemic, were unceremoniously dismissed for refusing the jab. The same went for police officers and firefighters. This, along with piling further misery onto the lives of these workers, added to the fragility of what had already become a precarious situation. Fewer emergency workers. Businesses were coerced into enforcing the vaccine passport, with failure to do so resulting in fines of up to $50,000. People were arrested for merely posting online about a potential protest taking place. One pregnant woman was arrested at her home in front of her young son for making an online post in relation to a protest. Something snapped in the minds and hearts of thousands of construction workers when the vaccine mandate arrived at their door. Days of heated protests in Melbourne were met with a militarised Victoria Police response that saw rubber bullets and tear gas deployed on unarmed Victorians in Melbourne's streets. Armoured vehicles and numerous assaults by police added to growing fear, anxiety and depression in an already traumatised population. The pinnacle of the unjustifiably aggressive and violent response to the concerns of Victorians was laid bare on September 22nd of last year, when a militarised police force shot at unarmed Victorians at the Melbourne Shrine of Remembrance. Victoria Police, acting at the discretion of Daniel Andrews, shot at the very people he was charged with representing the interest of. God only knows the cost of these police exercises, the destruction of the public trust, the harm Daniel Andrews has caused Victorians, financially, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. How many Victorians now rely on welfare because of the decisions of Daniel Andrews? How many businesses have been crushed, never to return? And what is the cost of this to our society? How many Victorians took their own lives during these past few years as a result of the insane policy directives of this man? Objectively, Daniel Andrews can only be described as by far the worst Premier in Victoria's history. By far the worst Premier in Australia's history. But simply put, he's fucked Victoria so badly, she may never recover.
digital ID. He's just fucking blowing your car up. Just fucking burn himself and shit. Fucking hell, Melbourne. Dan Andrews, that's on your fucking hands, you dog.